Hi, class. It's Professor Corbett again, coming to you through Blackboard to talk to you about week two. So we're off to a great start. You've got some great postings on your discussion boards for this past week, and I'm looking forward to even more for the next few weeks. You're doing a great job. So basically, we're going to be covering 4 chapters this week. I started off with 3 last week to start off a little more slowly. We're going to do 4 this week. We'll do 4 next week, and then the final week we'll go back down to 3 to slow down a little slowly. So again, this week we're going to cover maybe some technical ground here, particularly when we talk about the first chapter, which is chapter 4, dealing with the physics and chemistry of fires. I know this was difficult for some of you to read this, or will be reading this. You don't have to be an expert in it, but there's some takeaways here that I think are important. So let's go over some of them. So the textbook talks about the types of the components needed for a fire, the 4 critical parts or components of a fire to have a fire. So those 4 components we call, when they're put together, the fire tetrahedron. The fire tetrahedron is actually based on the old fire triangle. So a triangle, of course, has 3 sides. A tetrahedron is 4-dimensional. So we had to add a 4th side. So what are those 4 sides? The first one is fuel. Okay, we have to have something to burn. I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? The next one is oxygen. So that usually is what we get from the atmosphere. You and I and everyone on the planet breathes in oxygen in the air, basically. The third component is actually a source of ignition, and it might be a spark, or it might be a flame, a lighter. It could be all sorts of things, but basically a source of ignition. And then the 4th side of this triangle is something very mysterious. It was added maybe 30 some odd years ago by a professor down in Florida, actually, Walter Hassler, who tried to explain how certain extinguishing agents put out fires. And so they don't remove fuel. They don't cool the surfaces down, so there's no cooling involved. So that takes away the 2 of the sides, the fuel and the temperature heat side. So if you're not cooling it, you're not doing anything with the heat. The 3rd side, of course, was the oxygen that I mentioned. And if it doesn't suffocate the fire, how does it work? And so he took this to understand that, there's a 4th side of our fire triangle, and that's the uninhibited chain reaction. And what that means basically is that when a fire is burning, it's a series of chemical reactions. And if you have the ability to sort of put a chemical or some material into that combustion process, you can inhibit the chain reaction and actually stop the fire. So again, the takeaway from the fire tetrahedron is you remove any one of those 4 sides, the fire will go out. And so pretty much any extinguishing material we use, of course, water is the most obvious, but we also have things like dry chemical extinguishers. We have carbon dioxide. We've got these weird materials called halons. We've got water mist systems. There's a whole bunch of different types of materials that we use to put fires out. Of course, water being by far the most common one. But again, when you remove one of the sides of the triangle using one of these extinguishing agents, the fire goes out. So that's an important concept in chapter 4. Another important concept is we call heat transfer. But before we do that, let's just make sure we understand the difference between heat and temperature. Okay, so of course, when you talk about temperature, like the temperature today is very hot. How hot is it? Well, gee, it's 92 degrees. That's a measurement that we're taking of molecular activity, actually, in the atmosphere. Basically, the air temperature is 80 or 92 degrees. So that's again, when you think temperature, it's a measurement. When you talk about heat, it's related, but it's not the same thing. So heat actually is a form of energy, and it's heat that's generated from a fire. So understand that we talk about temperature and heat, they're actually, again, related, they're connected, but they're not the same thing. They're 2 different things. So that's important to understand that concept. Another one is the methods of heat transfer. Maybe that was a little confusing to you. We talk about heat transfer, literally saying moving heat from this area to somewhere else. And there's basically 3 ways for that to happen. One is through convection, which is typically the hot gases from a fire that you see the smoke column going up and things. Those are convective heat currents, and so you can transfer heat from where it's basically being generated in the base of the fire. Those currents that are going up that plume, we call it, are convected heat transfer currents. Those actually can take the heat to another remote location and start a fire. So for a very tragic example, many years ago in Harlem, there was a fire in the Schomburg Plaza high rises up there, and a fire had started in a trash chute. And unfortunately, there was miscommunications during the fire, and the fire department thought they had put the fire out because they found the trash in one of the lower floors jammed into the trash chute. But in fact, all those hot gases, heated gases, actually traveled up the shaft, the trash chute shaft. And of course, when it hits the top of the shaft, it's not open. So it's like a big cork in the top. All the heat then and hot gas started leaving the shaft on the uppermost floors of that high rise. So much so that actually it spread the fire from the trash chute to the adjacent apartments on the upper floors. And several people, unfortunately, had to jump to their deaths during that fire. So that was, again, a very tragic example. Had a lot of other implications for communications and dispatchers and all sorts of other kind of thing of making sure we know what's going on at a fire scene. And so it's important for that. But in terms of heat transfer, that was a very tragic example of that. The next type is conduction. Now, all of you, maybe when you're younger, your mom or dad was cooking something on the stove and you went to go grab the frying pan on the stove and it was hot. Ow, you hurt, right? Your hand hurt when you touched that hot metal. That's heat transfer through conduction. It's literally contact from the hot object to something that's not hot. So heat's going to move from the hot stuff to the not hot stuff. That's called conduction. And finally, the last one is radiation. Many of you, of course, have been in people's homes or places where there's fireplaces. And you probably noticed as you got closer to the fireplace, you would start to feel heat on your face, basically. With some form of energy, actually, heat energy hitting your face. That's radiant heat transfer. Literally, the fire itself is sending these transparent electromagnetic waves is what they actually are. They're transferring these waves out and of course, impacting things. So every one of you that's gone to the beach and has gotten a suntan, you were attacked by electromagnetic waves from the sun. It's heat transfer through radiation from the sun, if you want to think of it that way. But in a fire, you could imagine how, like in Brooklyn and certain places, built up areas of wood frame buildings, for example, that if you were to have a major fire in one building and the next building right next door was only 4 or 5 feet away, the fire could jump from one building to the next in what we call radiant heat transfer. So that's some of the basics of fire behavior. There's other things, of course, in the chapter that we don't need to go into great detail on the video and stuff, but please read it over. I think, like I said, you'll find it intriguing, to say the least. And it's the basics of fire. And even every firefighter who goes through a fire academy has to be trained on what a fire is by definition and how to put it out, how to deal with that fire tetrahedron, how to remove pieces of the fire tetrahedron. Okay, the next chapter is chapter 5, which is public and private support organizations. This chapter is chock full of acronyms and names of organizations. Now, I don't expect you to know all of them. But there's some more important than others, perhaps, in there. They're all important to some extent, but there's some private ones that you should probably know about. For example, the National Fire Protection Association is one of the biggest fire organizations in the world. It's got 30,000 members. It's based up in Massachusetts, outside Boston. They've been around since 1896. They write hundreds of codes and standards for everything under the sun. They write the code on putting fire alarm and sprinkler systems in buildings. They actually produce the National Electrical Code, which is just about every jurisdiction in the world uses that. They also produce documents dealing with specific hazards. They actually just came out with a standard on active shooters because the fire service plays a role in active shooters and EMTs play a role in active shooters. So that organization is very important. Another private sector organization is Underwriters Laboratories. As a matter of fact, I've made that one of your one of your discussion board questions for this week. UL has been also around for around the same amount of time, since the late 19th century. They're based outside Chicago. They're basically a nonprofit organization that does studies of every sort of electrical device and most other kind of devices under the sun. So that's kind of what your discussion board is about, UL and what that means and what have you. So there's other organizations. Factory Mutual is another one. They're a very big insurance company and insures and does testing on industrial related fires and things like that. So you'll see them in the list. And there's also the government ones. And of course, we see the Department of Homeland Security and we see the FEMA and the U.S. Fire Administration. Those three are probably the big three when it comes to the types of things we deal with. So Department of Homeland, let's put it this way. The U.S. Fire Administration is the federal agency that's focused on fires, okay? That involves research, but also they run the National Fire Academy, okay? So that is one organization. They are part of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which you're probably all familiar with. It gets involved in all sorts of disasters and things. And then they, in fact, are in turn part of the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11 to try to get a more coordinated response on a variety of kind of issues and stuff, but particularly for our type of things, better responses from multi-discipline agencies from across the board, federal, state, and local organizations. So those three are probably the big three takeaways that you have in terms of the public sector. The other one, of course, is the the Boise-based wildfire efforts that we have in government. There's a whole wildfire piece. The Interagency Fire Center is what I was looking for. They're based out in Idaho. They look at wildfires across the country. It's not something we deal with here in New York City, but it's something we need to think about, particularly if you end up moving somewhere else in the rest of the country. Wildfire might be a much larger issue for you in other jurisdictions. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the National Forest Service both have, and National Park Service for that matter, all have roles in wildland firefighting, of course, depending upon where it is in the country and what property is owned by the federal government and things. So wildland has its own sort of separate group of organizations at the federal level that deal with the wildland fire. So that's another group you should probably focus in on in chapter 5. Now, chapter 6 deals with sort of the basics of a fire department. And I guess the fire department resources. So I guess the important thing here is what are the basics of a fire department? Well, every fire department in the United States started with one thing, a fire engine, okay? They don't all have ladder trucks, but they all started with at least one fire engine. As a matter of fact, I think I told you in the last video, if you want to go see one in New York City's original 2 from 1731, you go up to Hudson, New York, and it's on display in a museum up there. So every fire department in America, for the most part, has a fire engine. That's the piece of apparatus that carries hose and most cases some amount of water that the hoses can be deployed and sprayed on the fire and the fire be put out. So it's pretty basic function, right? Couple hundred years ago, we decided that we needed another type of apparatus called a ladder or a truck company. And those are the pieces of equipment that carry, of course, the ladders. In some cases, they carry a whole bunch of small, we call ground ladders. Those are the ones you pull off on your shoulder and then put up against the building and climb up, as well as an aerial device, a much more substantial ladder on top of the truck. That might be a straight, what we call a straight stick or regular aerial ladder. It looks just like a gigantic version of the ground ones. They extend out like an accordion, basically, or a telescope, I should say. And then, some of them might be a snorkel, which just has a bucket on the end and it's got an articulated movement like this, like my elbow here, and it actually takes the bucket up and it can go over things. That's called a snorkel. Then you've got what's called in New York City a tower ladder, which is sort of like that. It's sort of like taking the bucket of a snorkel and putting on the end of an aerial ladder. So the bucket actually goes out from the ladder truck, out. So those are the ladder company or truck company and engine company are the two most basic pieces of equipment just about any fire department in America. In the book, they talk about a whole bunch of other pieces of equipment, which you might potentially find dealing with wildland fires, foam units for flammable liquid spills, hazardous materials teams, vehicles, all sorts of other kind of different kinds of things and stuff that you might actually find or need at a fire scene. So the larger the city, of course, the more equipment they have, the more diverse amount of equipment they have. But again, the baseline for most fire departments in America is simply that engine and in a lot of cases the ladder truck. Those are the two basic pieces of equipment, okay, for firefighting. Now, of course, ambulances are a different situation. Most EMS agencies in the country are run by fire departments. And I have a discussion board related to that question or that situation as well that you'll be looking at. So EMS units, of course, are very important to us. The design of the ambulances, what they can do, what kind of equipment they carry, what specialized things they might need. So again, it runs the gamut. Rescue trucks. I mean, we carry a lot of specialized equipment for auto accidents, collapses, all sorts of things that we might need. So that's pretty much what Chapter 6 is dealing with. And then Chapter 7 basically is all about the requirements for the sort of setup for fire department administration, the chain of command, and that kind of thing. And of course, what you see, just like in any typical organization, is a pyramid, right? So the person's leading organizations at the top, and as you go further down, and more people at the bottom, basically carrying out the actual work. So in a fire department, of course, we have the fire chief. Okay, he used to be called the chief engineer because he was head of all the engines. That's how they call him, the chief engineer. So the fire chief is in charge of the fire department, and again, just about any fire department in America is always a chief, and there's usually some officers on the way down. And in New York City, there's thousands of officers, basically, running all the way from deputy assistant chiefs all the way down to lieutenants. So it's lieutenant, captain, battalion chief, deputy chief, and then a variety of assistant, deputy assistants, deputy chiefs, all above that rank, all the way up in the FDNY. In a small department, a small volunteer department, you might have a chief, assistant chief or two, some captains and lieutenants, and basically that's it. So again, it just depends on the size of the city, how many officers we have, but it's all about the chain of command, right? So that the responsibility is higher and higher and higher as you go higher up in the organization, right? So it's important that the chief understand what's going on at the ground level, basically. In a fire scene, you can imagine it's one thing if you're at the firehouse and talking about administrative affairs and things like that, but a fire scene, it's not much different than a military operation, right? There's no joint decision making in a fire scene, so firefighters don't get in a group and decide, how are we going to deal with this? It's command, is you're given orders to do specific things within your own realm of training and responsibility. So when it comes to that, that's kind of the way it works, just like the military, basically. There's not much of a difference there. That's what we call the fire service, in some cases, a paramilitary organization, because that's the way it's organized. So in the chapter, you can see all sorts of different hierarchies and charts, talking about, again, the chain of command. Basically, the fire scene, the first officer arriving, the fire scene is in charge of that fire. And as other officers get there, some more senior officers get there, and chiefs get there, that command is transferred from, let's say, a lieutenant in the first engine that arrives at a fire. It's transferred perhaps to a captain, or more likely to a battalion chief who arrives at the scene. And then if the fire gets so large the battalion chief can't handle it by himself, he's going to call for additional fire alarms, right? Second alarm, third alarm. That will bring more chiefs and more senior chiefs. And so bigger incidents bring bigger chiefs. And so each time a new chief arrives that's higher in command, they will assume command. So they literally will go to the one who's in command right now and say, okay, what's going on? I'm going to assume command. And basically they'll take the responsibility of running the incident or fire from the lower officer, and that lower officer then will go and do some other job, basically. He may stay at the command post or what have you and things. So that's important. Span of control, they talk about that. It's basically making sure that, span of control, you hear that in every organization. You don't want to have a leader or an officer having to control typically more than 5 or 6 people. Once you start controlling much more than that, there is no control, because you can't monitor and watch what's going on. Because at a fire scene, it's a safety issue, right? We're sending firefighters into a very dangerous environment, and there's got to be tight controls of what's going on. We don't lose people. We don't want to keep an eye on things, giving orders to evacuate the building, changing strategies. All those kind of things are really super duper important. As far as staffing goes and organizations and things like that, there's a big issue in the fire service right now, in terms of staffing levels. But before I talk about that, let me just mention there's 3 generic types of fire departments. There's volunteer departments, which are, of course, just that. They're basically firefighters who don't get paid to do the fires. They're basically have jobs doing something else, and when they're called to a fire and their pager goes off, they have to go to the firehouse, get on the engine ladder, and go to put out the fire, deal with the situation. Those are volunteers. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what are called career departments, like AFDNY, or career, or what's the word I'm looking for? Full-time firefighters, basically. Those are firefighters that are paid to do what they do, and that's their W-2, that's their full-time job, basically. And it's sort of in the middle, it's what's called combination departments, where they have some volunteers and some paid people. Area around Washington, D.C. and Maryland has a lot of those kind of departments. My own experience with them is that they're very difficult departments to manage because when you have firefighter A standing next, who's being a career firefighter, who's being paid maybe six figures, standing next to firefighter B, who's doing the same job and isn't getting paid anything, a lot of times there's friction, there's tension between that situation stuff. It's always there. There's always tension, those kind of department stuff. But some cities can't afford to hire a full-time fire department, and so they end up with these sort of quasi-full, quasi-volunteer departments and things. So that leads me back to the issue of staffing. So staffing is a problem for every fire department, career or volunteer, or a combination for that matter. None of us are where we need to be. There's that same NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, rates a standard for staffing. There's very few fire departments in America that actually meet it because we just don't have the resources and money to do it. In the case of the career departments, they don't have the money to hire enough people to do it. Okay, New York City is unique in the sense that it's got a very large department and stuff, but that most departments don't have anywhere near the resources FDNY has. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of volunteer fire departments. Think about your own life. How many of you watching this video would have the time to go to a 4 or 5 month training class 2 nights a week, and then go 1 night a week to training, and then do calls on top of that? A lot of people just don't. They got 2 jobs. They just don't have the time to do it. So staffing is a significant issue in the fire service, and of course, as you can imagine, when you don't have enough staffing, certain jobs don't get done properly, they don't get done at all, and safety becomes a really big issue. People can get killed because you don't have enough people that you're putting on the fire scene stuff. So basically, that's pretty much, we're going to return to this sort of concept about, not so much staffing, but command structure and things when we later, 2 weeks, when we get to the end of the course, we talk about the incident management system and NIMS and things like that. Where we're taking not just the fire department, but we're taking police, we're taking public works, we're taking other city and in a lot of cases private sector organizations and plugging them into a much larger command structure for major disasters and things like that. So it follows what we've been talking about here in the fire service side of things, but there's sort of another perspective on this, a different way we handle larger disasters and things. So a couple of weeks we'll be talking about that. So again, keep up the good work. I've got 4 more discussion boards up there for you. I've got a quiz up there for you, 20 question quiz. You're getting 30 minutes for the quiz, and you should be all set. So any of you have questions, I've got a few during the week. Just shoot me an email. I'll try to get back to you as quick as I can. So anyway, good luck.